and welcome to Alzheimer's Speaks Radio. I'm your host, Lori Lobe, and I'm so excited that you're joining us today. We are going to have a fascinating conversation as usual as we learn from people all around the world at all ages and stages of life. Stay tuned as we shift our dementia care from crisis to comfort.
Here we go. What you think about, you will bring about dementia change. We will.
Well, hi, everyone, and welcome to Alzheimer's Speaks. I'm your host, Lori Lobe, and I'm thrilled you can join us today. We are going to be talking with Julie Moore, who has written a fabulous book, and we're going to be discussing about the importance of you finding your voice to benefit those you love when you're caring for them. Being an advocate is so critically important. But before I introduce you to Julie, I'm just going to throw out a couple of things. One, I always encourage people to go to alzheimersspeaks.com. We have a ton of free educational resources. If you click on that button, you'll see things like information on Memory Cafe, Dementia in the Arts, Dementia Chats, our poetry section, and so much more. There's also a tab for public events, and you can click on that and see what you might enjoy when I'm speaking publicly and some of our ongoing things like the Memory Cafe and the Caregiver Connect group that is an in-person group here in Minnesota. I would also encourage you to check out dementiamap.com. That's our sister company, which is a resource directory. It has wonderful articles in the blog. It's got a glossary of terms and an events calendar and so much more. So with no further ado, let's talk to Julie. So Julie, I'm so excited to have you back with us and the launch of your book. I know how exciting that is. When I launched Betty the Bald Chicken, it was kind of like this surreal feeling that you put your heart and soul into, and then it's actually there and
absolutely
ready for people to see. So congratulations on
Thank
that.
you.
If you don't mind introducing yourself to our audience, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So again, my name is Julie Moore, and I currently live in Southwest Florida. My husband and I, we have two beautiful grown children. We've got two grandbabies, and I am actually a retired veteran. I spent 30 years in the Army. I retired back in 2019. I don't know how much more you want me to go into.
Well, go ahead. What caused you to write the book?
So I began caring for two family members. Back in 2016, while I was still on active duty, my older brother, who at the time was 54 years old, was diagnosed with early onset dementia. And once we got the official diagnosis, which ended up being FTD, frontotemporal dementia, about a month after his diagnosis, our mom, who had been in remission from breast cancer, got the diagnosis that it had returned in her spine. She actually ended up taking our brother in after, 6 months or so, because he had gotten to the point he really couldn't live by himself anymore. And I talk about it in my book, but she took him in. And after 18 months, almost 2 years, we realized it was really just too much for her. And I had retired by that time. So I took them both in. And what really inspired me to write the book was, first and foremost, I'm an educator. I taught in the military. I taught when I was young, growing up, learning how to twirl baton. But my inspiration really comes from the desire to educate wherever I see a gap of knowledge of information. And witnessing firsthand what families are experiencing and expected to manage on their own, I found a shortfall in society. So my goal was to try and assist readers with bits of that missing information, but also help them discover their voice while they were advocating for their loved one.
And shortfall is putting it lightly.
Yeah, I'm being nice.
it's a big dip and a big dive
Right.
when you start caring for someone, and you don't realize all of the avenues that change, that need to be addressed. And it's not just going to the doctor. It's
Mm,
every day, living, it's socialization, it's finances, it's so many bits and pieces that
absolutely.
people overlook, because I think if we all looked at it from the get-go in this big hunk, we'd probably pass out.
Oh, absolutely. And then not only that, it's we all have challenges going on in our life.
Mhm.
And in the book, I share a lot of my own personal story and the challenges that I was going through when I took on that role as caregiver. So it's my hope that I'm encouraging others that read it. I'm encouraging that reader. We all go through challenges. Just embrace it, learn about the disease, and um, just be patient,
Yeah.
really.
And that's a really good point to say that, none of our lives are perfect and running on 8 cylinders all the time,
Right? Oh my
without a little
gosh.
putt-putt here or there. And
Yeah,
sometimes it's a major putt-putt in a absolute breakdown,
agree.
in structure, and just even in our support structures that help us, plug along. And then you add in somebody else's world, and a human being that you're now responsible for. That's serious business, and I think most people who are caring take it very seriously. And I also think when we take it really seriously, a lot of times we forget to laugh. We just
Very
get
true.
so overwhelmed, and I don't know about you, but I found laughter is a huge um, coping mechanism for me in the long run. Not laughing at it, but just the situation of who would have
Sure.
thought, and then getting to the other side of it. And sometimes you can't laugh until you are the other side of it.
And that is true. And that's kind of where I'm at now. I'm learning to laugh again.
Mhm. Yeah. And
So,
that's a brilliant thing to have back in your life, when you feel that that's been stripped. I never realized how it affected me, because I'm kind of that type A personality, and thought I
yeah.
was just in charge and coming off like that. And when I was caring for my mom and dad, one of the things that happened to me when I was selling real estate is I was still plugging along, and I had my team, and which gave me a lot more flexibility. But years later, I sold a house to clients that had probably bought and sold with me 3 or 4 times. And I'll never forget the woman looking me in the eyes and go, "You have the most beautiful blue eyes." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you." And I said, "Sometimes they're blue, sometimes they're green." And I kind of pushed it off like that. She's like, "Lori, I only knew you with like dark black eyes." And
Wow.
I was shocked. I said, "You got to be kidding me." And she's like, "No, your eyes were just," and I'm looking at the screen right now going, "Oh, my eyes kind
Yeah.
of look darker."
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but I think it's just squinty, and I don't let as much light in because
Right.
I'm older now. But that was fascinating to me that
That is interesting.
it was really interesting. She's like, "You didn't have this brightness in your eyes that you
Wow.
do now." And that was like 10, 15 years after the fact.
Yeah. Wow.
So, and I don't wear contacts, so it wasn't that.
Nice. Okay.
But yeah, so sometimes we don't know that we're even being challenged, especially I think when we're a type A personality, that's just
Yeah.
what we do. We just push through and
Just push. Yeah.
through. So, how did your military background, do you think it prepared you for some of these challenges in caring?
I really do think it did. The military taught me how to be a leader,
Mhm.
and it also taught me how to take care of others around me, whether that was just a fellow soldier, even my superiors, or their family members, my own family members. But being a leader is more about gaining trust from those around you
Mhm.
and less about being a boss or bossy and barking orders. And I needed my brother, who was losing both gross and fine motor skills. I needed him to trust me that I would catch him when he would fall.
Mhm.
And then for our mom, even though she was doing all of her ADLs, she still had needs. And one, she needed to trust that I was going to take care of her son.
Mhm.
And she also, or I needed her to trust that I would listen to whatever her needs were. So the military taught me a lot. I do dive into a lot of details about that in the book, but I definitely leaned on it for sure.
Well, and I think that whole honor and respect and dignity piece, I
Yes,
would think would really pull into that as well, because
agreed.
that is one of those things. If people don't feel respected, which can be
Hmm.
kind of tied into the whole trust, but I, to me, I see them as kind of separate a little bit too.
Yeah,
I think that impacts a lot in terms of what you can accomplish with somebody who you're caring for. You're not going to get as
sure.
much pushback from them if they take your lead, if
Yeah,
they have confidence in you. Um,
agreed.
as a leader. And, so often I think family caregivers in particular, think when someone's pushing back that, well, they're just doing that to push my buttons. They know
Right.
how to irritate me. They know how to control me. And I always found that it wasn't a purposeful pushback. It wasn't planned, it wasn't
Right.
laid out. Maybe in the early stages they could still do that, but as the disease
Yeah.
progressed, but that it was like they were scared. It didn't feel right.
Yeah.
Something was missing in the equation. So I like that you mentioned those things: the leadership, the listening, the trust, the honor and respect of care in terms
Hmm.
of how that equation is put together and how you work together as a team. Because you're not a dictator coming in, do this, do that, but you're letting them be part of the team, and
Absolutely.
that makes a huge difference,
I agree.
as well on that. Were there some really moments that were just unexpected to you and really eye-opening in terms of the realities you were facing while caring for your mom and your brother?
Um, Most definitely, especially with the disease that my brother had with the frontotemporal dementia. My eyes were open in many ways, but I think the one that sticks out the most was the disconnect between medical professionals and the gap of information that's available to families when it comes to this thing called dementia. And my expectations were very, very high going into it. Um, I think what frustrated me the most was because I was so attached to that frustration, I kept, questioning, why am I asking these same questions? I'm not the first person to ever be a caregiver to someone with dementia.
Mhm.
Why am I, why do I feel like I'm on this wheel and going nowhere? Um, So just being attached to that, what I had to learn was to let go of that attachment. And I'm not Buddhist, so if anyone's listening, I'm asking for forgiveness now, but I understand that they have this concept, I don't even know what the right term is called, but they talk about learning how to let go of attachment. It's like holding on to your 5-year-old's drawings and they're now 40 years old. At some point, you got to let it go. But when it comes with dealing with medical professionals and having that gap of information, I had to quickly learn I need to do my own research. I can't just sit here and complain and be frustrated. I've got to do something. So what is in my control that I can do? And
Mhm.
that's what I did.
Well, when you mention the hamster wheel, because it's like I'm just repeating myself over and over, and
Yeah.
just no one communicating on this side of the fence at all. And it is frustrating. And we rely on those professionals thinking, kind of that they're God and they're going to have all the answers that we need. And they really
Yeah.
don't. And they're
Right.
really undereducated, because there's so many things they have to be educated on,
True.
and dementia is constantly changing. But we ran into the same thing as a family. I mean,
Sure.
and again, it was many years ago. It was like 40 years ago when we started this journey with my mom. And, the first 10, she was just told it wasn't even dementia. They just kept saying it was menopause, which it
Wow.
wasn't. And then, so then you go back 30 years when they finally go, yeah, I guess it is.
Right.
And I mean, people weren't even, the word dementia wasn't even used back
Right.
then. Everything was Alzheimer's. There wasn't
Yes.
FTD. There wasn't
Or
vascular.
senile.
Yeah, hardening of the arteries. It's what happens
Right.
when it gets old. And we didn't know there was an Alzheimer's association, and we didn't hear about them through the doctor. I mean, that wasn't even a
Wow.
connection. So in that fashion, there's a lot more out there, and the conversation's more open.
I agree.
But boy, it's a crapshoot on who you're talking to,
It is.
and where you make those connections. But at least the connections are in the light a little bit more and not so much in the dark. We just have to get the medical professionals pulled into the light.
True. True. And just getting connected to support groups, like your platform that you have, or Dementia Map, if I can mention that here. Those are great resources that really help people.
Well, and there's, one of the things that I found, and I don't know if you found this, but there's a lot of people like you and like and many, many others that we step into this and we don't really even look at ourselves as a resource. We're just kind of a caregiver with some knowledge, but
Right.
we don't look at ourselves as an equal to these big organizations who we all think are going to do all these grandiose things for us as far as support. And some do and some don't. And it depends on who's on board. I found that it's really down to the people in a lot of our organizations and even, governmental departments. It depends on who's in charge of,
Right.
what's the philosophy these days. And that changes
That
constantly.
is so true. That is so true. Yeah, the philosophy of it. You're right.
Yeah. And so it can be, it can be a senior community, it can be a church, it can be anything. But I think one of the things that I have found that's so important is for people to step up and step in at whatever level that is. You don't have to write a book, you don't have to do a
True.
podcast, you don't have to do things at that level. But it would really, really be appreciated if you just are open to have a conversation. And when you see somebody in need, share information, because it is hard to find when you're on the outside, because you don't even know where to go, and then you don't know what to trust. You can go to Google and you can, find the people who paid the most to be at the top of the list, but that it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be the best fit for you, or that they're, and a lot of times I think it shuts us down to search for other options because we don't know there's even other options out
That is
there
true.
and stuff. So, encouraging people to share their knowledge, and I know I didn't feel like I was very knowledgeable. I just felt I was lost and doing the best I could.
Yeah.
And then when I started talking with other people, that's when I found out, oh, I do have knowledge that's valuable, but I didn't see that within myself at all.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I found too, is because of my own experiences and because of the research that I did do, I often find myself in just random conversations, and somebody will just happen to mention, yeah, my mom just found out, she's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And I just start regurgitating all this information. And they're like, really? I didn't know that. How did you find? And then it clicks, and I go, okay, here I
Yeah.
am.
Yeah, it is. And it's nice when it's this natural conversation. And I think, to me, I still think word of mouth is the best
It is.
referral. It's the best advertising that any of us can ask for, because it's coming from the heart from
I
somebody.
agree.
You can tell if someone's pitching it or if they've lived it and they've
Yeah.
really experienced.
That is so true.
And that makes such a big difference. So I think that's one of the cool things with your book is you're sharing so much. You're sharing their side of the story, you're sharing your side of the story and your life experiences and how those mesh together and
Exactly.
work or don't work on some days, because
Exactly.
because I
Yep. Some things worked, a lot of things didn't.
yeah. Can you explain to our audience a little bit about what FTD is? Because there's probably some people that don't really know, what frontal temporal dementia looks like. What are some of the symptoms that you and your brother had to deal with?
So, for starters, what I learned early on in my caregiving role, everyone hears the term Alzheimer's. Everyone knows about Alzheimer's, but Alzheimer's is actually only a type of dementia. Dementia is this umbrella. And another type of dementia is FTD or frontal temporal dementia. And from what I've learned, and I recently became a volunteer for the organization, the Association for Frontotemporal Dementia, and I've given one class, so I'm still learning a lot. But it affects the frontal lobes and the frontal lobes that deals with speech, it deals with vision, it deals with some of your filters, and then also I don't know what the lobes are called, kind of in the back, but it's where the memory's at. A little bit on memory, but not a lot. It's really more about those fine motor skills and losing your speech. So my brother lost his peripheral. That was one of the first things that we noticed. And then he slowly began losing his ability. It started with he couldn't remember a word. He couldn't make a complete sentence. And then that slowly started turning to kind of gibberish where he couldn't speak at all. But it is a type of dementia that actually has a lot of different subtypes. And based on, there's no definitive test. It's all about symptoms. What symptoms are they presenting? He had PPA, which hold on just a second. Get my handy dandy book out because I had it in there. So he had primary progressive aphasia, which is what affected his speech as well as his vision. And let me get to, there's so much. Another one is behavioral variant, and that's where a person's, all of their filters are gone. So they may kind of like someone that has a tic or what's that syndrome? Starts with a T. I'm forgetting right now. They could come up and make a very rude comment about your backside or, how you look or cuss at you. Maybe you have a very sweet mother, Christian woman that never said a bad thing about anything. If she comes down with the behavioral variant of FTD, she may end up having the mouth of a sailor, So there's a lot of different types. And it's just a matter of trying to recognize the symptoms. AFTD does actually have kind of a checklist on a couple of these different subtypes available on their website. And again, it's just a list of symptoms. Your loved one may have some of them, they may have none of them. It's just a matter of getting with someone that a doctor or a neurologist or someone, a support group that can share different symptoms so you can maybe help identify what your loved one may or may not have. Here in Fort Myers, they have a facility called the Dubin Center. I have not been there yet. I've only just learned of it about a month ago, or I would have included it in my book for sure. But from what I hear, it is a facility that is funded by outside organizations so that they can provide free services to not only the person diagnosed with dementia, but the person caring for them. So they provide training. You can get tested down there. They have a variety of support groups that you can join, both in person as well as virtual. So
Okay.
finding something like that would be great.
And just, we speak a lot of times in all these initials things.
Yes.
And FTD, you would think would be the association or America's frontotemporal dementia, but it actually is the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. Yep. And
Correct.
so that can be a little bit confusing, but if you
Agreed.
if you put it in, it will pop up. And again, I'm glad you mentioned the PPA, the primary progressive aphasia. And again, people like aphasia, what's aphasia? And again, it's that speech, kind of that jumbling of the words that is so common. And it's interesting. I don't know if your brother could do this, but I know so many who have had this. They can say a sentence that is so jumbled up, but they don't miss a beat in cadence.
Yes.
And it's and what we found, like when I did dementia chats, we've had a couple of people who have had that. And if we all paid attention, which we did, we always could understand what the person was saying, even though the words weren't always correct. And it gets harder as things progress. But
True.
kind of in that mid range, it's like everybody knew what it was. And sometimes the words were a correct sentence; they were jumbled, and sometimes it would be elephant instead of they wanted to say car. I mean, it would just be nothing that gave you a clue.
Yeah. And sometimes it was like, in the earlier stages, it was like playing Pictionary with him, I think because he had acid reflux and we had just had lunch or something and he was getting that indigestion and he needed a Tums, but he couldn't get the word out. And we had been doing other things. So I'm trying to track where his mind was, what is it that you're trying to tell me? And as soon as I went, you have acid indigestion? And it was like his whole body relaxed. And he was like, yes. That's it.
Ding, 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 ding.
Yeah.
Yeah. Or we both win,
Right.
on that one. But it is, and it kind of, for me, it kind of feels that way sometimes when you're able to decode, it feels like a really strong win for both of us, because how frustrated they are trying to communicate when they can't. And sometimes, some people can get aggressive when they're not understood, dementia or not, that's just kind of how some people deal with it. And so it's really a mind game in terms of sorting out the pieces and trying to, I love how you said you had to backtrack to kind of figure out what might be triggering really this discomfort,
right,
that needs to be addressed. And I think sometimes we don't kind of put on our investigative hat. And that is so helpful when we learn to just carry that with us all the time. Well, I'm going to take a quick break here. For those of you that are just tuning in, we have been talking with Julie Moore, and she has written this wonderful, wonderful book called I Am Their Voice, a guide for caregivers and advocates. And it's just loaded with great tips and insights that, I kind of think you'll carry it around as your little Bible, for yourself, because, there's just so much that we don't know, and a book can give us such great comfort. We're going to get back with her in just a second. But in the meantime, you can always go to her website, iamtheirvoice.com. You can email her at iamtheirvoice23@gmail.com. She's on Instagram as Julie, I Am Their Voice. She's on LinkedIn as Julie Moore 2016. But I want to just take a second to talk about Q for Good. Q for Good is actually my webmaster, but I I just love them to death. And for, I don't know how many years I've been probably on computers now, probably with websites of my own, 40 years I've struggled in terms of trying to understand code and all the changes constantly going on. And Q for Good has just made it so easy. They can do pretty much anything that you want, from designing a website to doing updates, to, if you want to set up a store, newsletters, all that kind of stuff. And they just make it really simple, and they communicate really clearly. And they're very reasonably priced. And I've never ever said that about a webmaster, that I adore them, but I really do. And I don't get anything, for saying that. It's kind of like dementia. I just want to spread the word, that there's hope when you get frustrated with stuff like that. So I just wanted to give them a plug, and then we'll get back with Julie now, because there's so much more that she has to share with us. So Julie, thanks for letting me take that moment to give Q for Good a plug. But I want to get back to you. A lot of times people are kind of balancing and running with maybe having a business and staying active and advocating for, caregivers and all of that. How do you manage your own well-being? Because I know others have all these balls in place. I mean, it might be a person who is retired or at home, and they're just caring for that person. And I don't want to minimize that, because that's a big job. But it's really easy to forget about yourself. And then you have others that have all these other multiple things. Like you're running a business, you're trying to stay active yourself. You've got a family, and then you're out here still advocating. How do you do that, and do that well?
So that is certainly a daily challenge for sure. I believe I would say it's because I begin my day being active first. I've always been very active. Childhood, of course, being in the military, you have to stay active, you have to stay fit. And what I discovered was, just learning in the military, activity, exercise, movement, it's good for your body, it's good for your brain. You release endorphins naturally. And I begin my day anywhere between 5 and 6 o'clock. I am out of bed. And if I'm not at the gym, then I'm journaling. I may meditate. I don't meditate a whole lot. That's actually something I'm trying to learn to do more of. Or I'm looking at my to-dos for the day, for the week, and I just dive right in. I think, again, just being active is just a huge role in and of itself for my overall well-being. I also just advocating for caregivers, beyond providing care to my mom and my brother. Writing this book was another step in that process. So sharing my experiences, sharing my mistakes, sharing my successes, and just trying to advocate for others. That helps me as well, because it continues my healing journey. And as far as trying to balance, you mentioned balls. That just takes me back to a great story I learned early in my military career. Someone shared this with me. And I'll share this, and then we'll move on. So anytime you're dealing with priorities, if you can categorize them into 3 balls, start with a rubber ball. And Lori, I'm going to ask you this question and you can answer. What happens when you drop a rubber ball?
It bounces back up.
It bounces right back. Okay, keep that in mind. Second ball you have is made of steel. If I drop it, what happens?
It's probably going to put a dent in the floor.
Yeah, it's possible. It's going to make a very loud noise. And if it lands on your foot, it might hurt.
Yep.
The third ball, though, it's made of glass.
Mm-hmm.
If I drop it, what happens?
It's probably going to crack all over the place.
Going to shatter.
Mhm.
So when you have a lot of priorities, if you can think about those three balls and look at it from, is this priority a rubber ball? If I drop it, it's going to bounce back, still going to be there. Nobody's hurt.
Mhm.
It'll be okay if it sits and waits.
Mhm.
Maybe it's a load of laundry, dishes in the sink. It's a rubber ball. It'll be okay. But a steel ball, like I said, it's going to land hard. It might hurt somebody's toes, might hurt somebody's feelings for you to tell them, no, I'm sorry, I can't do that today. But it'll be okay. It's something you can circle back around to and come back to. But that glass ball, that's the one you got to hold. That's the one you need to take care of first. And that is a family member. That is your loved one. You've got to take care of them first. So whatever their needs are, and that could be you, whatever your needs are. So finding that support group, finding, is there some place that you can use respite to give you a break? That's that glass ball. You can't let that ball drop.
That's a great analogy. The one thing I would say, because I agree with it all, but the one thing that I think sometimes can get confused or muddled, and it did for me, is I probably saw myself more as a steel ball and a bull in a china shop, and I'm just going to get stuff done and I'm in control. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm forceful, but that's what's needed. And I had no idea how fragile I was,
Yeah.
that I was about to crack.
Agreed.
Because I just wouldn't let myself go there. I've always been in control. And so
I
that
can
was
relate to that for sure.
really foreign to me. So, I would just say to people, try to be honest with yourself. And I think for me, I didn't slow down enough to even like peek behind the curtain, or look in the mirror to kind of see where I was really at. But telltale signs are like when you, like I would get really irritated with my brothers, like, why aren't they helping? And that wouldn't normally be my reaction, but I would get really, really frustrated. Or when I was really at my wit's end, and I always thought this was a coping mechanism. I'd let the family leave the house. I'd shut all the windows, and I'd go down in the basement. I'd scream at the top of my lungs. I never do that. I mean, that's just not me. But I was like, gotta get this out of me. It's like I was really a glass ball, and I guess my screaming allowed me, to get that out, of my system, because I really saw myself as, it was supposed to be the steel ball, but I didn't want to show that I was that fragile to anybody. And I think part of it was I also felt like I'm showing it, they're just not picking up on it. But I also, when you have your guard up, you're really not showing it. It's kind of like when we care for somebody with dementia, when we'll say that we'll walk in the room and they're doing just fine, and then we walk in the room and then all of a sudden they're getting aggressive or getting agitated, and it's not because they are, but it's because they're mirroring what they're seeing in us, and sometimes
that is true.
Know what we're projecting.
Exactly.
And
they can pick up on your anxiety, and that will stir up their own anxiety.
Yeah. And so sometimes I think we have to really look at how are we really coming off, not how we want to come off. But it's easier to believe I came off really good. I was in control. I did that really smooth. And it's just like, no, you really didn't. You were kind of like a bull in a china hutch. And you were intimidating to maybe not just even the person you're caring for, but other people in the family feeling like they can't step in because you're going to do it your way. And I know I did that. I wasn't aware
I did too.
Doing that until my family and I had a conversation, and it came out like, well, why weren't you around more? Well, you really wouldn't let us. I'm like, what do you mean? And they're like, well, you're a control freak. No, I'm organized. So we had very different perceptions.
Yeah.
But again, it was important to have the conversation. And
Ah,
I wish
that's
we
great.
as a family would have known how to have that conversation earlier, but yet, you get all those dynamics in play. Like I told my brothers, I said, okay, I'll take some responsibility for you not coming around because of the way I acted, but I won't take it all because you easily could have had this conversation, but it was much easier for you to just let me do it because you also didn't want to deal with the
That is a
emotions
fair point.
of the
That is,
situation. But
yeah,
we're not good at having those conversations, and then like you said earlier, letting it go instead of, you know, feeling used and abused or
right.
whatever, just acknowledging everybody has their own perceptions and where do we go from here, I think is really, really important. But I love the ball analogy. So thanks for sharing that. I'm sure a lot of our
Welcome.
listeners will be able to use that as well.
Welcome.
Is there any advice that you would give to others who are maybe just stepping into the role of caring for someone?
I would say be prepared to listen
Mm-hmm,
and be patient.
mm-hmm,
Seek first to understand your loved one, understand what they're going through, be willing to see the world through their eyes, and embrace the good days and the blessings that you have with your loved ones. Don't be afraid to ask questions. If there's things out there that are confusing, doesn't make sense, I don't care if it's the umpteenth time that you've asked the question, whatever it takes for you to understand so that you can better assist your loved one, ask those questions. And probably lastly, just have as much fun as you possibly can. Um, Try to make light of situations the best you can. Um, Allow things to roll off your shoulders. If something happens that your loved one, whether they're being rude or they don't do the right thing or they drop something, just let it roll off your shoulders and keep moving. It'll be
yeah.
fine.
Yeah, I think that's where people get really weighted down, is carrying all that stuff with them. And, it's done, it's over. Are you going to let it impact the rest of your day, the week, or your relationship
Exactly.
for good? That's a really important question to ask yourself. And, is it worth it? Kind of go back
Is it
to,
worth it?
is it a rubber ball? Is it a
Yeah,
glass ball? Is it a steel ball?
exactly.
What really is it? Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share?
No, not really. I think we pretty much covered, we covered a lot.
Yeah, we
I think we
really
did.
did. And I think we did it in just a really easy way to understand, which sometimes
I
I
hope
think,
so.
I think we get so overwhelmed and everything seems so complicated, but you gave some real life examples, of what's going on and how to deal with it and how to cope and how to watch out for yourself as well in this whole thing. Well, I guess one other question that I would have is, we talked about how you did. How did your family members do with you caring? Because I know sometimes there can be jealousy, even with the husband or adult children, like, I don't get as much of your time anymore. Did you run
Sure.
into that at all?
Um, my family was very supportive, especially the siblings. I speak about them a little bit in the book, but when we looked at all possibilities, even when mom took our oldest brother in, it was the only available option.
Mhm.
I was still on active duty and I had requested what's called a compassionate reassignment. And the Army looked at my family tree and said, "You've got four other siblings.
Uh-huh.
No, we're not going to approve this."
Yep.
And so the only viable option was for her to take him in. And so we then just provided some type of emotional support the best we could. And the same thing when I actually took them both in.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they either had a full-time job that they carried the medical insurance. There was
Mm-hmm.
no way they could take either of them in,
Mm-hmm.
or they cared for their grandkids, or, you know, again, a full-time job. So it just made sense for me because I was retired and
Mm-hmm.
I had the time available. And again, my family, my kids, my siblings, they all supported me where they could, you know, and there were times they would come down. I speak one time in the book where my father was dealing with Parkinson's and he wanted so much to come down, but he lived, my family has always lived far apart from each other since we were adults. And so we kind of did a convoy. I have another brother who went up and picked up my dad, drove him to my sister's house in Jacksonville. I was living in Tampa. My sister then brought my dad down to Tampa.
Mm-hmm.
They spent a couple of days there, and then she took dad back home. And then my other brother picked him up, took him back home. So, you know, it was just this teamwork. Wherever we could contribute, we contributed. So,
Oh, that's fantastic. That's nice to hear. I know everybody's family structure is a little different, and some, you know, get along and don't have, you know, any glitches at all. Others have bumps and bruises as they go
yes,
and
I've heard them.
adjust. And then others don't even talk from the get-go, and it gets really, really complicated.
Really hard.
There's no right or wrong way, you know, to do this, but I think talking with others and just hearing their stories can soothe your own process in
True.
terms of how you care, and maybe give you some ideas, and maybe you'll be able to share some of yours. It takes away that isolation and that,
It
you know,
does.
in the back of your mind, am I doing this right? You know, is there
Yeah,
other?
that was a almost an everyday question for me. Am I doing this right? Should I do something different? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Well, thank you again, Julie. People can get a hold of Julie by going to her website. And again, that is www.iamtheirvoice.com. You can email her at iamtheirvoice23@gmail.com. She is on Instagram as Julie I Am Their Voice. She's on LinkedIn as Julie Moore 2016. And again, the book is called I Am Their Voice, a guide for caregivers and advocates. And as you can tell from the conversation we had here today, it is filled with lots of gems. So again, thank you so much, Julie.
Thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. For our listeners, I always ask you to be a giver of hope. Like, click, and share this episode with others. It's so important for people to know that there's resources out there. And so you don't always know who in your sphere is in need of this stuff. And, you know, what I love about, you know, even these conversations we have here on Alzheimer's Speaks is, yeah, they're dementia and Alzheimer's related, but you know, you can use this information with your 2-year-old or your husband or your teenage kids or your friends or your coworkers. There's so much to be able to pull out because caring is caring. And we do that in every aspect of our lives. And the one that we probably don't do as much for is ourselves. And there's lots to learn there too. So thanks, everybody. We will see you next time. Bye for now.
Thank you, Lori.